it's a common trope in in many of these books that the family unit's got to go at some point because your family's not going to be like, hey, I'm going to go into this portal and I'm going to go to this other world and I'll see you guys later. No, that's not going to happen.
Welcome to the Skiffy and Fanty Show.
Who's to blame for the hate that hate made?
It's a really good quote. I'm Sean.
I'm Daniel.
And today we're joined by the wonderful P. Djèlí Clark, author of many things such as The Black God's Drums, The Haunting of Tramcar 015, Ring Shout, A Master of Djinn, and this brand new book we're talking about today, a middle grade adventure called Abeni's Song. Welcome to the show, Fenderson.
Hey guys, thanks for having me.
This would be your third time, I think, on this show.
Yeah.
So...
I should know the ropes by now. I should get behind the scenes and
Do you want to be behind the scenes of this show? It's a chaos zone. I don't know.
Don't we give it a special prize for number 3 for the third time?
Well, if you get the record,
okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
It's like Steve Martin hosts Saturday Night Live, right? I get to there's like a special club I can go to. And...
I think you've got to beat. Yeah, you've still got 2 more. You got to do 2 more, and then you get the record.
Okay. Oh, excellent.
Then you get the special pin, lets you into all the parties.
Yeah.
I get to go to the diners, the 5-timers club.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah.
So, friendly reminder to all of those before we get to the questions. We want to hear from you, our listeners. So share your comments with us about this and past episodes at skiffyandfanty.com/listener-suggestions. We want to put together a listener mailbag episode with your thoughts, questions, topic suggestions, and more. So get those thoughts in.
Also buy this book and read it.
Please.
Definitely.
So, speaking of the book, can you tell us a little bit about Abeni's Song? What is this book?
Sure. So, Abeni's Song is my return to fantasy. Probably my first love is fantasy, though I do all this other stuff as well. It's a secondary world fantasy, very influenced by West African and African diaspora folklore and myths and settings. And it's about a young girl named Abeni who lives in this small village in a forest, like the backwaters of this world. And the most important thing to her in life is basically going to Harvest Festival and celebrating her birthday, which happens to fall on the same day. And again, that's the most important thing in her life until something terrible happens. Her village is attacked, many of the people scattered. She ends up being pretty much the sole survivor, the person who escapes, and she escapes because of the help of a mysterious old woman that people call a witch. And after this, Abeni is kind of thrown out of her world. She ends up living in a witch's house. She ends up caught up in this larger adventure, in this larger struggle against several terrifying figures. One with the wonderful name, the Goat Man, and the other, the big baddie in this world, the Witch Priest, right? And so really the story is like a found family story where she is trying to find her family again. She's trying to find her friends and reconnect. And that turns out to be a bit more difficult than she can imagine as she enters a world of adventure, magic, and of course, monsters. Lots of monsters.
Lots of monsters. And creepy ropes.
Yes, and creepy ropes.
Ropes, just to let everybody know. So I wanted to start with a sort of general question, because this is your first middle grade fantasy work. And I was kind of curious about, as you began to approach writing for this particular sort of age category, what were some of the challenges and joys of sort of approaching fantasy from this particular group?
Yeah, I mean, joys were, I think this was the age for me when I was probably doing the most reading. This was the age, that I was tearing through the Narnia books and The Wrinkle in Time and Earthsea Cycle and, rereading The Hobbit and all those things, getting introduced to all those books. It was like my beginning, and I'm dating myself here, reading books like Encyclopedia Brown and Danny Dunn. Those were like I was just constantly reading, right? And so, and also it was great television. Again, dating myself. This is when I was watching The Never-Ending Story and, things like The Dark Crystal and, all these kinds of things. And so on the one hand, returning to writing a book set for that age group was me returning to, I think, the time when I probably most enjoyed reading, when it was the most fun thing to do. And reading was, I can't wait to sit in my room with one light on, with the book open, and just trying to finish this thing until I fall asleep on it, right? I was like spacing out. I can't wait to get home so I can read, for the weekend. And so it was me getting back to that stuff, that magical time when I was reading. I wanted to write something, for that age group. The challenges of it is I'm old now, and that was a long time ago. And trying to remember how I was thinking at the time, the things that I found fun. What was it that made me love, A Wrinkle in Time and A Wind in the Door, and maybe think that was the best book I'd ever read in my entire life? What was it that made me like those things? And it was me trying to find that and find that voice. That was the biggest challenge, I think. To connect with kids that age who, a lot of things have changed since I was a kid. So how do I write a book that is both speaking to someone of that age, dealing with the things that they might be going through and the things they might be encountering, and at the same time not talking down to them? Because what I loved at that age were books that treated me in some ways, if not like an adult, at least, something close to it, right? And didn't talk down to me. So yeah, those were the challenges.
Well, you spoke about the books by like C.S. Lewis and Madeline O'Engle. And so I had heard or read elsewhere that you were also looked into more modern middle grade books as well as you were preparing for this. And so I guess I was curious what some of those were. Did any stand out in particular that made you realize something new or feel something again, I guess, of your childhood?
I had read earlier first of all, I want to say this. The amount of books out there in middle grade and YA now is enough it's like somebody walking up and saying, I want to start listening to jazz. I want to start listening to hip hop. Where should I begin? Right? It's just, this isn't like hip hop. It was like 1980. You could be, here are these five. Now it's like, I don't know what to tell you. It's explosive. And that's how it is. I felt looking at the middle grade and YA section, I had to walk out, my eyes glazed over. I was like, what is dark academia? What is that? And so it was just so much stuff. And that's great, by the way, that there is so much stuff is excellent. And so even when I bring up books, it's like, it's the small few sections of books I've read. Like, I think the Tristan Strong novels were a great influence for me in thinking about how middle graders might today, the kind of things they might like, that might be different from when I was reading. And it's funny, when you read those books, you do realize these are kind of middle graders who are a bit more mature than when we were, because the topics that they're allowed to explore, the way they act, they don't have that absolute innocence. And this falls over for a lot of things, like going just out of this subject, looking at Wheel of Time, which I had read. And then I look at the show, and it took me a while to realize when I read Wheel of Time that those characters were supposed to be like 19 and 20, because in the book, I was like, these are 14-year-olds, aren't they? They talk and act like, So, it was that kind of thing that I think was I read some other Rick Riordan books. I'd read some of his books that are set in the one where the kids are in the ancient Greek gods, and then had another one with Egyptian gods. And so I think those were the few. And then I'm trying to think of the name of this book right now. I know I'm looking, it's somewhere here, but I get lost in my own book stacks. Yeah, so I'm going to end that. I can't find one.
One thing I was curious about is you were talking about, because you'd mentioned a whole bunch of things that I remember reading when I was young as well, or watching. And I was wondering, this book, its opening 50, 60 pages features some pretty kind of scary imagery.
Yeah.
You made me think, like, when you mentioned The Never-Ending Story as a film that you remember when you were a kid, I also remember that when I was a kid. That movie still scares the bejesus out of me. It's a terrifying film. And I wonder if that was something you were thinking of like, there's something about really impactful media for young people that the ones that really stick with us are beautiful and wonderful and full of amazing images, but also are quite terrifying.
Yeah. Yeah, because I think you're right. I think because they deal with some serious topics, like I think a never ending story, the fact that, like when the horse dies is still like one of these saddest things, or the rock biter saying these strong hands, right? Like it's just again because I think it seemed like before this people didn't want to bring up these topics with you, and now you're watching or reading things that have these more mature topics. Like I remember talking to someone and they said, when you're talking to middle graders and someone dies in the book, don't play around with it like, oh, they're gone. No, say they died. Like just be upfront. And so I think part of it, I think again, goes to this notion of not talking down to the readers. And as much as I wanted this to be magical, I wanted to recapture all that magic. I said the best books were the ones that didn't just scare me, but had these really serious themes, right? That intersected the magic. I think of like Earthsea or Wrinkle in Time. Wrinkle in Time has like some real, like you go back and watch this, like, okay, there's some real serious themes about authoritarianism and all these other things that are in here. In the second book, there's this angel figure that like basically X's himself out of existence to save people. And I remember that stuck with me. I was like, he didn't just die, he was like uncreated. That's like that was like it blew my mind. It still blows my mind, it gives me chills, right? And so yeah, I wanted to bring some of those themes in there. And I warned people, I said this book there's humor in there, there's adventure and everything, but it can get dark. It can get dark sometimes. And there are some dark themes in there. Some powerful themes that I think, I hope that gets people thinking and talking.
One of them that kind of stuck out to me, because it's set up at the beginning, but because of this radical, scary moment where she loses her family and all her friends, it changes, which is growing up. Because the very first thing we learn about is, this next harvest that she experiences, she's going to go through the first rites to becoming a woman, becoming an adult, as it were. Of course, those specific rites don't occur in the same way because now she's with the witch. And so that seems like it's a fairly common theme, but I did like that you seem to sort of disrupt the natural course of that by just somewhat terrifyingly ropes and all of that coming out and stealing the family away. So that familial connection that's with adulthood is completely broken. I was hoping you would talk a lot about exploring that in this book.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is like I was like, what better time to have this happen on the exact, like nothing can go wrong on my birthday. Right? My birthday has to be, those are the great days. And like for it to happen on the birthday, and it's also this celebration, it's just, I thought it was best that it happened during this period where no one expects it, right? And it does. It's just jarring where it's like, oh, everything's fine. Then, everything is just thrown into tumult. And, part of this with breaking the familial connections was, again, I wanted this to be about her having to search and find herself as well as all these others. It's part of that journey. But also, it's a common trope in in many of these books that, the family unit's got to go at some point because your family's not going to be like, hey, I'm going to go into this portal and I'm going to go to this other world and I'll see you guys later. No, that's not going to happen. And so I forget who I heard saying this, a famous author whose mind is I'm blanking on right now, but he was like, yeah, you got to get rid of the familiar units. So they got to, either they're dead or they get removed or something, but otherwise kids aren't going to get to go out and have these adventures in the world. They'll be, come here, you're not going anywhere. And so, part of it is me playing with those tropes and seeing how can I make them a little different, even though there are tropes like we look for it sometimes in reading. So some people I think are good. They've broken from those and they've like purposely included the parents in it and they found different ways. And I appreciate that. But I also like the ones who are like, I'm like, yeah, how are we going to get rid of these parents? You gotta do something to get them going because, it's a song when I was growing up, parents just don't understand and you can't have parents trying to cramp your style during your adventure.
I mean, I imagine we grew up, well, differently, but similar age groups, I imagine. And so I was just thinking of how much time I just spent not in the house, wandering around in the neighborhood.
I don't think they allow that anymore.
Yeah,
they don't allow that anymore. No. My mom and I have had conversations, and she'll find out stuff that I did when I was a kid because she was at work or something, and it's like, yeah, Mom, like, what'd you think we did when we went outside? Like, We didn't just stay in the parking lot.
Yeah, there's still some things they don't know.
Yep.
It's just best that they don't.
Yeah. There's some
four
things
alarm fire.
Yeah, I don't think I'll tell my mom. No, I won't say it because she might listen to this. Never mind. I won't tell her that story of the thing we did that I'm still shocked I did, but
Yeah.
whatever.
So those are the times, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess going with those themes, Abeni loses her family. That familial unit goes. But then she starts discovering new family, new friends, and partially that is then taken from her too. And she's like, there's a role reversal that ends up happening here where she ends up with responsibility. She never thought that, like, hey, I'm just a kid. I shouldn't have to be making these decisions and figuring things out. And so I thought that was just another fabulous way of thinking about playing with those tropes of getting rid of the adults. There's lots of middle grade books that I enjoyed back as a kid. And recently we were talking about like the John Belair's horror books, the Gothic horror books. And the adults would always be absent enough so the kids could get into some trouble. But ultimately the kids came back, or the adults came back to kind of help the situation. That's not the case here. It's the kids need to figure things out, the younger amongst them. And so that I thought was really cool. I guess it intersects with that theme of exploring friendship, which is huge in this, I thought, of forming friends and accepting friends.
Yeah.
Despite limitations.
And I think, by the way, thank you for saying all of that. That was the most spoiler-free, just skirting around the line.
Tried to be, yes.
Big part of the book. It's literally why I was like, part 2 of the book. I gave people a breather so they could get like part 2, because people said they said thank you because I needed to breathe after, after
right,
another loss, right? And,
yeah.
And at one point I did wonder, I said, am I doing too much here to the character? But I was like, no, like you said, I really want to explore this story. And the reversal was like, that was a big part, right? That's like a huge part of the story, where Abeni now finds herself in a role she never thought she would be in, right? And it turns her world upside down. And then she meets these new friends who are, like you said, with limitations, who are very different from her, who are more powerful than her, even older, far older than her, even if they may act her age. And it's a challenge for her. She's already been taken out of everything she knew, and she had friends before. She was not like she wasn't a lonely kid. She had friends and everything before, but now she's completely thrown as this fish out of water, right? To me, this is, any kid who shows up and it's like new school or neighborhood. Like, how do I deal with this? And she has to deal with these friends who, at least one of them, let's call her Zania, can be a bit much, right? So part of this was me thinking about friends or people I knew back then who might have been sort of friendly, or maybe we were like frenemies and sometimes we hung out because they knew somebody else, and how I managed to get along with those folks, even though they were difficult. And part of that, I think part of the things I always think that middle grade is where you're learning that, and it's kind of sad, it's away from the period like when you were in maybe earlier grade school when everybody was just friends kind of and everything. I always figured this age in middle grade is when like real bullies show up and you really have disagreements, and you had old friendships where you guys were all cool through kindergarten and first and second, and then suddenly things start shifting and people start pulling in different directions because everybody's trying to figure themselves out. And so I thought this was a great way to toss her into that maelstrom, right? And give her some challenges. Give them all challenges, right? They are not a cohesive unit, at least early on, right? They are really different in many ways, and for them to work together. And so I wanted to explore that.
And so they're different, I think, in a lot of respects due to the fact, or their differences are drawn out because of what they've experienced in their lives before and what has affected them. And so going back to that quote from you that I opened up the episode with, read it again, who's to blame for the hate that hate made? When I was thinking about that and thinking about what the characters were going through in Abeni's song, I was I was wondering if you see friendship as an ideal basis for working through that question. Is that something that you're trying to explore here in this novel as well?
You know, in partly one of the things I wanted to deal with here is that, especially for Abeni, she's dealing with a lot of internal issues. For her, if it's not exactly hate, is mistrust. It is this feeling of abandonment. It is the idea that what she really hates, that grown-ups don't tell her the truth, don't tell kids the truth, that they keep things because they think the kids can't handle it, and as you can see, it blows up then. And so she has to deal with this where she has a lot of anger, a lot of this anger that she's trying to work through because she's angry at the situation. She's like, why did this happen to me? She's angry at the situation, that what she's been put into, and she's angry at some of the people around her who she sees maybe responsible for this, but it's sometimes hard to be angry at them because they're not exactly the person they were. Let's put it that way. And so, yeah, and that's just frustrating to her. And it's a theme that I really want to explore, and I have to thank my editor for telling me constantly. She's like, "I love this theme. Pull it out more. Pull it out more." And so I think when she finally really confronts it, and how, if it's not hate, like you said, that anger, like in that second last chapter, can transform her into not good, that anger can be used and manipulated. She has to learn how to deal with that, right? Lest it be manipulated in a way. But I like how you've put those two together, because I hadn't even thought of that there's a similarity there, right? That this kind of anger can come back to haunt you.
Yeah, I guess I just immediately thought of Yoda, like anger leads to hate and hate leads to the dark side. And so when saw that, I was like, yeah, there's a lot of, internalized anger that the characters are facing. And what I loved is that their journey, their adventure allowed them to work that out in the context of friendship, to like overcome all the creepiness. And
My favorite stories, kind of stories when they were younger, were I actually like the kids who just did not get along. It was the popular kid, or maybe the less popular kid, or the jerk, and then the jerk jock or whatever, and then something happens, and they both realize that underneath that each of them is dealing with their own things, and they find a way to suddenly bridge that, and they work together to figure out what have you, right? And so I wanted to explore that kind of thing here. I wanted to upset some tropes, like the mean girl trope, which I don't want to go into here, but like there's a whole mean girl trope in her village that I just really wanted to completely disrupt in the beginning, and certainly by the end, where it's like, yeah, I could do that trope. I grew up with those tropes. If you grew up whenever, we all had the mean rich guy or girl who wore that jacket sweater, and they were just all sweater tied right here, and they were just bad. And so I wanted to really change that up and make those dynamics a little different. But the great thing was playing with those tropes that people know, right? Because everybody knows those tropes and they expect them, and then like, oh, was not. I'm hoping they're like, oh, I wasn't thinking it would go that way.
And now it's a little differently, yeah. Or you think about it more deeply, yeah.
Well, so could we switch to more of I suppose, like thinking in terms of the world building, because this is secondary world fantasy, but as with all secondary world fantasy, we borrow things from the real world. And I know that Daniel has a question that'll take us a different direction on the history side, but I wanted to start with what I think I'm correct in, that there's a lot of West African folklore references here. The thing that stood out to me was immediately the Harvest Festival and all the masks, the people representing the different spirits, which I took a weird circle route to get to the reference, because I remembered, I think you lived in Trinidad and Tobago, if I'm correct, and that immediately made me think carnival. So, which obviously comes back to West Africa. So, and I was curious about, weaving all of that into this world. I mean, you've done that in a lot of your other work, borrowing from different aspects of history and folklore, etc. But this is a secondary world fantasy. It doesn't have any direct linkages to our real history. And I was curious about that approach for you.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's both liberating and yet also harder. it's somewhat easier when, I'm dealing with Macon, Georgia or New Orleans because I can shift it around, but it's exactly where it's going to be. The culture, I can pull on these different things, but here is like, it's like in the Matrix, we're like, this is the tablet, right? This is the blank slate build. And so it was a great deal of West African, some Central African things I'm pulling on, but I also bring a bit of the diaspora in there. So there is some like so and so. The Harvest Festival is looking at West African masquerades, very popular in many parts of West Africa. People probably know it, especially in places like Nigeria. But it's also, I said, you know what? I don't want to stop there. There is also some carnival in there from Trinidad. There's a lot of there are elements of carnival in there. There are elements of New Orleans second line in some of the things I do, and I do little hints. I drop little things here and there, but it's a mix, right? Because this is a completely different world. As much as you might mess around with a name or something, I said I wasn't as blatant as like, look, two moons, but you get the point. This is not Kansas. You're not on Earth. If you looked at a map, it wouldn't exactly make sense. But I'm drawing on those things as inspiration. And so yeah, it was a matter of me looking at some of these cultural tropes, aesthetics, and deciding how I wanted to deploy them. I was kind of I was kind of specific about certain things. Like I didn't use the exact names of any ethnic groups. Like somebody said, like, yeah, you never say like they belong to this. I said, no, I just said they're a village or this kingdom, but I've never used. I don't want to play around with ethnic groups. I haven't played around with any deities. In fact, I talk a lot about spirits in this world. And I say gods just generally, but I don't want to play around with things that people actually believe in or have. But you can see, oh, there's some that I'll pull in the second book. You can probably get a bit more closer and directly, like, oh, I see what you're doing there. But I purposely wanted to have the ability to draw on all those things, and yet at times be respectful to, and also give people a notion that where I don't want any one person saying, "Oh, I know where that is," because I've had readers before, not readers, but people I know who've read books, and let's say they're from Nigeria and they might be Yoruba, and they'll read something that has a bit of it in the name, and so I got thrown out because here you're pulling on something from my culture, and so I was like expecting this, and then it went another way, and so I did it even a bit different. I'm like pulling on it, but I stay away from a lot of the direct place names or such things to throw them off. Though I'll say this, a lot of the names of the people kind of come really close, so that might give it away. But yeah, that was me thinking about how to do this world building where it is a completely different world, and there are all these interesting elements I want to put in there, and how do I do so in a cohesive manner? Yeah.
That's really interesting. The way you describe trying to avoid that moment where a reader might go, I see that thing that's connected to my real beliefs or my real culture, but because obviously it's not that place, and it will go a different direction, they may find that jarring. And so to try to avoid that, not like extremely, but to just try to pull back from that a little bit. That seems like, did you find that was like a very delicate process, or did you find that kind of easy to do?
It could get complicated. Like I said, the most complicated thing were names. Like I think Abeni's name was probably one of the only direct names. A lot of my other names are more phonetic and similar. Like if you look them up, they won't exactly be the same, but you can. It's like there's a large swath of places it could come from exactly. But yeah, it was at times, and I think I went in and I purposely pulled back. Or sometimes I was wondering, like there was a time in there when I was just saying dumplings. And I said, no, I just want to say fufu. It is fufu. I'm going to say fufu because a lot of different people say fufu, and I just went with it, right? And so, it was a process, and it wasn't. I don't know if it was delicate or easy, but it was something I consciously kept in mind, and I still do. Even if they're in the second book, like I said, it's going to be much more distinct. It's going to be harder to do because I'm really getting into. It was kind of easier to do when Abeni was just out in the forest in a backwater place, but now there are cities and there are whole kingdoms, and so it gets a little harder to do. But it's still there in my head.
So as you go into that larger world, as I was reading Abeni's song, and thinking about those middle grade influences, one, Madeline L'Engle, C.S. Lewis, they're built so much in terms of Christian spirituality too, for better or for worse. But those elements are, and to varying degrees of obviousness, I guess. But
Supposed to be until maybe I was, I don't know, in middle grade or high school. I read that book.
oh yes, uh-huh.
I was like, he was supposed to be what? Never crossed my mind.
Exactly. There is spirituality in this, but I could see that as things get into a wider world, there's going to be even more of that. And do you find, either way, do you find that hard to balance to try to still make it universal for everybody, but still tell an honest story, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge. That can be a challenge, and I'm finding that, right? And part of that is not going too heavy. You just can't talk religion with some people, right? So I'm not, because of the way the story is structured, I haven't had to like have any deep conversation on people talking about religion. And so I'm getting to kind of skirt around it and just give little hints. I might say there's a priest or something, but I never go further into that. I world build in other ways so that I don't directly have to do with that. I mean, probably the biggest thing here is people understand that there are these spirits, that people believe in these spirits. And that's something that is universal in the cultures I'm pulling from. And it's also kind of universal in the world. And I think a lot of people, even if it's whether it's an African, so they can relate to this notion of spirits. So I play kind of loose with the fact that there are gods, but maybe some of these spirits are worshipped as gods because they are something more. Maybe some are ancestral spirits, or they're smaller spirits, right? And it's funny. Part of one of my inspirations was the anime Spirited Away. Like, and if anybody's looking, as soon as I say that, people go like, "Oh
Yeah.
yeah!" I said, "Yeah." It's so much of this was I love that notion of all the different spirits and so forth. So even as I'm pulling on these African cultures, I'm also pulling on these Japanese themes, right, of these spirits, and I'm translating it through this way. And so yeah, I'm hoping that it can have that kind of universal appeal the way that kind of film is, where everybody could, even if you don't come from a culture with a radish spirit who dresses in a Speedo in the elevator to go to a bathtub, everybody's favorite scene from Spirited Away, you can still get the notion of spirit beings and so forth. Yeah.
Is there significance to the spirit animals that you chose?
Um, Significance to me in some ways. Naomi, the porcupine girl, for instance. There was a film named Sankofa, done by this director. If you've ever seen Sankofa before, Haile Jarima, and there's a scene there where one of the main characters, Nunu, talks about a porcupine girl who survives on a slave ship, and that she's supposed to be the porcupine girl. And that idea just always stuck with me, and I just love the notion of a porcupine girl. But of course, she's also part hedgehog on her cousin's.
Yes.
Zania, who's the panther spirit. Hey, who doesn't like? I just needed somebody who could. That seemed to fit her, and so
Right.
there are stories in certain. Maybe is it West or East Africa? I can't remember which culture, but of like leopard women, for instance, who are thought of as these fierce, almost people who can shift into leopards and do different things. You remember that old 1980s movie Cat People too? So I wanted to like play around with that, and somebody who can shift into a panther. Come on, you gotta. It's just it was just those were the things where like, okay, what can I pull from, and it's also fun, right? And so yeah, so I found influences there, and I always say like I always think of somebody like Tolkien going into various mythologies, right, and saying I'm going to reshape how elves are. And I'm going to change forever how you think about elves. I'm going to change forever how you think about goblins. No, they're not little creatures that might know. They have swords, everything. And so I'm going to like change up dragons. My dragon's going to be a bit of an Eastern dragon, Smog, mixed with certain Germanic things. I'm just going to, and I when I'm doing it, I think I'm doing something similar, right? Like I'm taking, like there are these things in there, the Bat Riders, right? The Emotia, who are these bat riders, and that's like comes from a popular mythology that would come from modern day Ghana, for instance, about these giant bat. And it's different because it's folklore, so everybody has this like, no, it's a giant bat. No, it's a creature that looks like a bat with these long claws. And I was like, what if I made it? No, it's like a short dwarf. And I was like, who? And I was like, what if I made them like almost orc-like beings who ride giant bats, right? And so I took those, I looked at the folklore, I saw the different ways it could be, and then I didn't just take it and copy it one way. I turned into something that I want to do. And I call that, I don't know what you call that, but I said that's what you go read old books and elves. They're showing out like Tolkien's elves, right? Or his orcs and so forth. He's done something different. And I wanted to do something like that with the beasties and magic and creatures here.
That's a really interesting strategy, because I feel like the tendency a lot of folks have when it comes to borrowing creatures and things from the real world is to just pick one. You know, I'm going to take this version of the dragon or take this version of this thing, instead of making like an amalgamation of many different things. Or to think about like, well, what are the things we have, and try to find out what the unifying elements are that combine them all together. Which I don't know. I mean, someone's done it before, but I've never heard anyone describe that process.
I'm sure there's a word in some wonderful world building book for this, but yeah, it's my way of like, I took, creatures from this world, and it was like, okay, but I want to do a bit more, right? I could just give them to you just like this, but I want you to imagine them a bit more. Maybe people, when they saw it, didn't realize, right? They're confused because they see them at night and they don't realize, no, it's a person on top of that giant bat, right? And that's how I imagined it. And another things I just want to do for fun, I have a giant mimic salamander in there. It doesn't come from anything. That's just like, hey, wouldn't it be cool to have that? I just thought that was cool. I just like a good shape-shifting giant salamander.
I also like giant shape-shifting salamanders. So give me any reptile amphibian and I'm happy.
Yeah. The character who hangs out with him, Tutuo, that's actually taken from that is my ode to a very famous set of West African stories from Nigeria, written by a man whose name is Tutuo, and it's called the Palm Wine Drinkard. And if you got, that's where you know the palm, that's where I took his name, and he's supposed to have gone out into the world and he's seen all these wild things. And yeah, that was my little ode to him, which I think somebody like Marlon James, you read his works, he really pulls on, like I always say, like people like his book is so different. I said, go read the Palm Wine Drinker. I could see like the influences there and the way he tells the story. It moves in that way. Yeah. I didn't move in that way because I was trying to talk to middle graders. But yeah, that was my ode to him in that little bit.
I cannot believe I didn't catch that.
Listening, we have to keep that in there, because she was like, you can get rid of the veil. I said, I got to keep the veil. It was also taken from, just show you where inspiration can come. Anybody remember Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, the old stop action? The Island of Lost Toys. Remember? So,
oh yeah,
inspiration can come from anywhere.
That's wild. I can't believe I didn't catch it.
Huh? Yeah.
I can't believe I didn't catch that the Palm Wine Drinkard reference. I don't know why I didn't catch it.
Those are the little nuggets in there. It's like somebody who's going to catch, like, oh, he got it from Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, the Island of Lost Toys. No, because as I always tell people, your inspiration can come from anywhere. I heard someone once say, I don't know if this is attributed to him, but I've heard people attribute it to Mark Twain. I've never bothered to look it up because I just like to believe it's true rather than actually ever making certain. But the secret to originality is not revealing your source.
Oh, that sounds like something he'd say.
So let's just leave it. Nobody look that up, please.
So I know that Daniel had this question, but I'm going to steal it because I'm...
Yeah, go for it. I went twice, so...
Well, I was thinking, going back to, we've interviewed you for 2 other books, and I know that the issue of history, as we've been kind of poking at in different angles here, has come up before, and I'm just really curious, when you were talking about world building and, borrowing lots of influences from, things that are in the real world and things that are in our media, from films and what have you, there's an element of that which is just sort of like the exploratory writer type who's just like, I'm just poking around and seeing what's out there. But you also are a historian by day. And so you must have these moments as well where the historian hat comes in and it is just down historian rabbit holes of doom. So I'm really curious, like, when you came to approaching middle grade, like, how did the historian hat help? Or perhaps even throw wrenches into the process, if so.
I mean, if anything, I would say the history part of me, the academic in me, I had to at times tune down and not get caught into the authenticity trap where I can't do this thing because it might be cultural. This thing, it's like, wait a minute, I have a giant salamander. Why am I like being this? It's fine, right? So I have to sometimes tone down that authenticity, make sure I do it this way and this way, and I tone it down and be able to flow with what I found creative and interesting. So that's one thing. But it was also helpful, of course, in there are themes in here that are, I don't want to name them all, but there are themes of colonialism, themes of slavery, certain themes of war, the modern things are happening in modern warfare that are central. And so, all that was also part of the story. And so, those things were great to have the history mind, the politics mind, looking at certain things and bringing those into the story. In fact, I think when I was writing this, probably the main thing, I don't want to give it away, that has to do with the monsters and everything, was stuff I was seeing in the news. And I was, I drew that in to talk about that.
But even more so perhaps for the second book, as go to explore, like to seek out the ghost ships, I imagine there's opportunities to kind of not just quote authentic history, but use the history as jumping off points to kind of like rework things in different ways. Is that something that you're looking to do, or are you trying to just avoid that?
It depends on how close I get to it, right? There's certainly there are a lot of themes here about slave trading and other things that I'm definitely poking around with. And the second book is called Abeni and the Kingdom of Gold. There are things dealing here with, I'll give it a hint, the colonialism and the Ashanti and the British. I'm dealing a lot with that, the golden stool and all those kinds of things. But I'm also dealing with issues of resources and resource curse and, just a lot of other little things in there. So, it's a matter of, I always say this, I'm always trying to make certain that my desire to bring in some history or something, some kind of interesting intellectual thing, does not take away from the story. That the main thing is to tell the story, and the rest has to come along with it, right? But I am trying to keep people entertained more than I'm trying to, tell them some little historical or social or political tidbit. It's how I can work that in there.
So as a follow-up, we were kind of talking about this idea of authenticity. I was thinking about this book because, unlike a lot of your other novels, which have been set in real historical periods, where authenticity could have much more significance to the story, here you've got a secondary world. So you actually have, in a way, I don't know if you view it this way, like a lot of freedom to kind of bounce and go wild, as it were, because, you have this central story that you want to tell, and anything you bring in, it just needs to be consistent internally to the world. It doesn't necessarily have to fit to anything else. And I wonder if you feel that as you were writing this, that you feel that freedom of just exploration in a way.
Yeah, secondary fantasy gives you that liberation. There's no doubt about it. And so definitely I find freer, like I said, but it also brings more responsibility. I also have to I gotta think this up completely. I gotta think of clothing completely and everything. And then even so, I can't fully get away from responsibility because I am pulling from something, and I'm not doing it in such a way where N.K. Jemisin, for instance, talks about like when she does certain books, like her Inheritance trilogy books, she says, it's like if I made a soup and I just flavored the bone. I put so much stuff in there and I put the flavor of the bone, and that's all I'm putting in here. So you can't, when you read her books, like you read the Inheritance trilogy, one of my favorite books, you can't tell where she's pulling from in the world building. It's just so otherworldly and fantasy that there's no one place. And if you try to guess it, you're probably wrong. Right? In my world, I'm not doing that. I say I'm not flavoring the soup. I'm like, there are more chunks in there, right? And so I am pulling, even if I'm trying to mix them up, I am pulling for some real world antecedents that some people can pick out, right? And so
you're making a stew.
And so I can get caught up in that authenticity trap. Or it makes me have to be careful about certain things I'm saying and what I'm not saying, right? When I'm talking about certain things, so that it can be consistent at least with certain cultural understandings that we have of the world, especially for a part of the world that people misrepresent so often, right? It is very easy to go in there and do the very wrong thing because you're not thinking of certain stereotypes or ideas that are constantly in flux in there that people may not want to see. So, for instance, the fact that this is taking place and war is a trope here, right? And if you speak to people who talk about African media, like one of the things they say is annoying is that everything's always war, right? Like some of us, they don't show me like I'm just going to work, I'm just doing this. It's just always war, and so I had to balance that trope because I'm doing fantasy, and hey, war is a big part of fantasy, right? So there's wars going on, and that's the thing I want to talk about. But I also try to balance it with the peaceful life that Abeni knew in the village, or even like her with the witch, or they'll be meeting other kingdoms, just show like the differences and show a variety so that everything isn't flattened and the same, right? I'm careful to where like there are small villages, but look, here are also big urban cities that also existed, right? And so I'm trying to, and I'm consciously doing that. I'm consciously also trying to break certain tropes as well as while I'm writing, and so it is a balance. And I sometimes have to come back and think like there are certain words I'm not using quite purposely. You will never see me use the word tribe. Like it is not in my vocabulary because there's a long history that's done by Africanists who, talk about the problems with that term and its colonial inventions. And, there are some people who use the word freely and they've used it. I'm not knocking them for doing so, but I've made that decision. I had a professor, Nigerian professor once, who would actually dock points on papers. I was a TA, and he would tell me, take off, if they use tribe one time, take off tribe. Twice, 10 points. Okay. I'm not being that bad, but I will let them know. The professor would like you not to use this word. That's partly probably why I don't use ethnic group names, and I haven't yet. It may come to a point, and some people may get annoyed at that because they may be like, why does he keep saying the kingdom, but he never says to, because I'm like, because what I'm thinking is it's like the way we think today about whenever people think of parts of Africa, it's like they always like, what ethnic? And it's like people had other forms of belonging. They had other ideas of kinship, or they belonged to a state, or they belonged to some federation. It wasn't always ethnic group, right? That is in many ways, not fully, but a colonial holdover that the British and the French and others imposed because they made it control people and so forth. And so I never use that. I don't ever use the word hut. Even though it should just be an innocuous word, but the way it's sometimes used, I've seen people talk about, will use similar structures, and they're talking about the Vikings versus the Zulu, and the Zulu live in huts and the Vikings live in houses, right? And I said, there's obviously something going on there with the way we are structuring words and their meanings. And so there are certain words I purposely don't use. And it's just me. Other people will use it, will be very different, but those are like the intentional behind the scene things that I think about as I'm doing this. Yeah.
That's really interesting. It made me think of a novel, Creatures of Passage, where the author talks about different states in the United States being different kingdoms and different locales. So what you're just saying gave me like insight and that I had not picked up on what that word can mean of using that terminology. So yeah, really interesting.
I remember somebody said Africa is full of warlords and other places have cadres. And they said like, people have done this work. It's like not me saying that, people have done this work, and they've pointed out that these are media-driven tropes that have been handed down through time and how we think about certain places, right? And so I'm trying to break with some of those just to show people an alternative vision. Right. Yeah. I can do this differently. And it's difficult at times because I'm like, oh man, should I put in the kingdom name here? And I'm like, no, I'm not going to do it. Never said the name of Abeni's village. And I was like, oh, I've never said that. Like, I don't even catch that. And so I think about those kinds of things. But I'm hoping that I'm telling such other interesting stories, and I'm world building through other means, world building through food. Who doesn't love world building through food? I'm doing all these other things that people aren't going to be looking for those markers they might expect because it's a story set in West Africa. And they expect, like, I should know these things. I should know what the ethnic group is. I should know this and that. And I was like, no, look at the world a different way.
Well, okay, so we got to start to wind down, even though I'm sure we have other questions, but we can't ask every question because then nobody else would have any question to ask you. So... but the two big questions to end with are really simple ones. The first one would be, what are you working on next? Which we kind of already know the answer to, but tell us again.
Any Song 2. I am about 7 chapters out from the end. See if I can get this thing in on time. So I can't wait to put the end and send it off.
Fantastic. That'll be great to see. We'll have to wait 7 years for it to go through the publishing cycle, but still.
1 year is what they tell me, which is why middle graders grow fast, they say, and the book has to be, it's not like other books, it's got to be out and done. So the third one will be working on that, give myself a short reprieve and jump into that one. So.
Oh, fantastic. And then for folks that would like to find you and all your work, where would be the best places for them to go?
Sure. I have a website, an author site, pjellyklark, just my name.com. And you can find all my books, all the places I am. I'm on Twitter. Its name is Twitter. Not as much any longer, but you can find me there. I tend to be hanging out more on Instagram now, more than anything else. And it's always my name, P. Djèlí Clark.
Well, folks, thank you very much, P. Djèlí Clark, for coming on the show again. I know this was very hard for you to spend any time with us, but thank you.
That's great.
And then for folks at home, if you'd like to find us, go to skiffyandfanty.com and you can find all our stuff. There's our listener suggestions posts there. You can get all of our socials at linktree/skiffyandfanty. We have a newsletter, which is /newsletter. We're on Patreon, which is patreon.com/skiffyandfanty, and then give us reviews and all that stuff, and then all your money as well, because we need all the money. So we can buy more books from our author here today and then give them out. Yeah. For me, I'm at SeanDuke.net, Alphabet Streams on Twitch, and I've got other stuffs, but you can just go to linktree/SeanDuke for all of that.
You can find me at reading1000lives.com, reading1000lives.com, and also lots of other review outlet contributions. And you can find me on Blue Sky, also at reading1000lives.
Excellent. All right, since I'm still recovering from a cold, after this is over, I'm going to go hack my lung out.
I'll feel better, Sean.
It's episodes of Old Gods of Appalachia, which has become my favorite thing.
Oh, that sounds delightful. I should watch that. On that note, awkward ending and scene.
Now fly, fly!
If you want to support this show, you can go to patreon.com/skiffyandfanty or skiffyandfanty.com, our website, where you can get access to all of our fancy things. Our music comes from Holy Mole. You can support him and his work at patreon.com/holymole. Thank you for listening.